The town sat quiet under a pale morning sky, the streets lined with trees that hadn't yet shed their summer green. It was the kind of place where people believed they knew their neighbors, where trouble was supposed to belong to the big cities far away. On that morning, the air felt ordinary, almost lazy. But beneath that calm was a silence that would later feel like a warning, as if the world itself knew what was about to break. The street where it began was narrow, the houses pressed close, with fences marking small plots of land that families had guarded for years. Dogs barked at passing cars, children's bikes leaned against garage doors, and the hum of life seemed steady. But in one of those houses lived a man who carried a history no one in that neighborhood could have imagined, a history that would crash against their quiet routine like a storm they never saw coming. He was a man who blended in. To most, he looked like just another neighbor, calm, private, the kind who didn't gossip or hang around outside much. He lived alone, except for the dog that followed him everywhere, a large black shepherd whose presence gave the house its own shadow of authority. The dog was loyal in a way only animals can be, guarding the porch, watching the road, sitting by the man's side through long nights that neighbors never saw. They only caught glimpses of the pair when the man walked the dog down the block at dawn or dusk. People thought little of it. A quiet man with a dog. Nothing unusual. Yet inside that house, hidden beneath the simple life he showed, was a man who had been shaped by war, by missions whispered about in halls of power, by violence most people could not even imagine. He was no ordinary man. He was a former Delta Force commander, trained to strike faster than thought, trained to endure, trained to kill. But none of his neighbors knew that. They only saw the dog, the leash, the calm walk, and the silence. The police too did not know who he was. They had heard his name in passing reports when his license plate came up on a list, but to them he was just another address in a line of calls they handled every week. The officers in that department weren't looking for a fight. They were caught up in the rhythm of their job, in the small power they carried when they put on the uniform. That morning, they came rolling through with the same impatience they showed anywhere else. Sirens muted, radios crackling, boots hitting pavement with the sharp confidence of people who had never been tested beyond the safety of their city streets. They came without caution, without knowledge, and without respect for the line they were about to cross. In the house, the man had begun his day the way he always did, with quiet. He brewed coffee strong, the kind you drink fast because it keeps you steady, and fed his dog before sitting at the kitchen table. He had long since stopped watching the news. It only brought back the weight of years he tried to bury. Instead, he sat in silence, staring out the window, his hand brushing against the thick fur of the animal at his side. The dog had been his only companion for years, his tether to a life outside war. He didn't see it as just a pet, but as family, the last living thing that kept him from falling back into the darkness that always seemed ready to take him. The bond between them was unshakable, something no one else could understand. The street outside still looked calm, but a storm of its own was building. The police were responding to what they thought was a routine call. Maybe it was a noise complaint. Maybe someone had mistaken the man's silence for suspicion. Maybe it was nothing at all, just a misunderstanding that had been passed from dispatcher to officer until it turned into something bigger than it should have been. What mattered was that the police were on their way, and they were coming without realizing they were about to tear into a world they couldn't control. The neighbors who glanced out their windows that morning would later say nothing felt strange. The same postman slid letters into mailboxes, the same joggers passed by, the same hum of tires echoed from the highway. But beneath that everyday sound, there was a shift. Something off, something fragile. A sense that the air had grown heavier without explanation. The man inside the house felt it too, though he didn't show it. Men like him were trained to notice when silence changed, when a rhythm was broken. He didn't know yet what was coming, but his instincts whispered. His dog stirred, ears pricking, as if the animal sensed it too. The police cars turned onto the street with the sharp authority of people who believed they owned the ground they drove on. Tires crunched gravel, doors slammed, radios buzzed. They carried the energy of control, the sense that no one would dare stand against them. But what they didn't know was that they weren't stepping into an ordinary man's yard. They weren't just walking toward another house on another shift. They were stepping toward a man who had lived his life surrounded by enemies and had outlived them all. They were about to provoke something they had never faced before. The dog barked first, a deep, sharp sound that rolled across the fence and startled the morning. The officers exchanged glances, hands brushing near weapons, their minds moving in that split-second arrogance that dogs were nothing more than obstacles. To them it was just another animal, loud and aggressive, standing between them and whatever they thought they needed to do. But to the man in the house, that bark was not just noise. It was a warning, a promise of loyalty, a call that said danger was near. The line between calm and chaos had been crossed, and none of them realized how far that line stretched. The sound of the barking did not die down. It carried through the neighborhood, a warning that most ignored, but to the officers, it was something else entirely. They stood on the pavement, one hand on a radio, the other brushing against a holstered weapon, watching the shadow of the dog move behind the fence. None of them cared to knock on the door first. None thought about asking questions or waiting for backup. They were already tense, their nerves sharpened by the authority of the badge, and in that tension was the first spark. The man inside felt it before he saw it. His dog stiffened by the door, tail straight, body alert, and that was enough for him to know something wasn't right. He moved quietly, the way he had moved 100 times through foreign villages where one wrong step could end it all. Through the blinds, he saw the figures standing outside his gate, their posture rigid, their voices low, but charged with the kind of impatience that never led to good. His jaw tightened. They didn't look like men ready to talk. They looked like men who had already made up their minds. The first words between them were sharp. One officer barked out a command from the sidewalk, voice laced with arrogance. "Control your dog!" he shouted, as if he were addressing someone beneath him, as if he owned the ground he stood on. The dog growled low, pressed against the glass, unwilling to step back. The man didn't move at first. He knew tone when he heard it. He had spent a lifetime reading voices, hearing in them the difference between respect and threat. And this voice, this command, carried only threat. He opened the door slowly, his frame filling the doorway, his eyes scanning each of them with a calmness that unsettled. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke steadily, warning them that the dog was no threat if left alone, that there was no reason for weapons or shouting. But his calmness only seemed to irritate them more. One of the younger officers shifted forward, hand still hovering near his gun, eyes fixed not on the man, but on the animal that stood at his leg, protective and unyielding. It might have ended there if not for pride. The officer repeated himself, louder this time, as if volume could make authority real. "Get that dog inside now!" The man's eyes hardened. He had dealt with arrogance before, in uniform and out. He had no tolerance for it. But more than that, he would not let anyone command him inside his own home, not when the only soul he trusted, his dog, was being treated like a target. The neighbors who peeked through their curtains saw only fragments. A man standing at his door, a group of officers growing restless, the sound of barking that never eased. They couldn't hear the words exactly, but they could feel the tone. It was sharp, heavy, like a storm pressing down on the block. Some thought of calling for more help. Others stepped back and shut their blinds. People always turned away when tension grew too heavy. Inside, the man's chest was tight with the kind of anger he hadn't felt in years. He had spent so long trying to live quietly, to bury the part of himself that had been built in battlefields. But the sight of strangers threatening his dog, the one being that had stood by him through every sleepless night and every memory that tore at him, It clawed at something deeper. The officers didn't know it, but they weren't facing an ordinary man's anger. They were facing the first cracks of a rage held down too long. The officers didn't see it that way. To them, it was simple. A barking dog, a stubborn owner, a call they wanted to close quickly so they could move on. But every word they threw out, every command, every insult dressed as authority, added weight to the air, tightening the coil that was ready to snap. One officer muttered something under his breath about people like him not knowing their place. Another laughed in a short, bitter way, as if the whole thing was a joke. The man at the door heard every word. His dog growled louder, the sound vibrating against his leg. Other pressures were pressing in too, though none of them showed in that moment. The department itself had been under heat for weeks, accused of mishandling cases, of abusing power. The officers on that street carried those shadows with them, the weight of bad press, the whispers that their authority was slipping. They came ready to prove themselves, to show they were still in control. And in doing so, they made themselves blind to what they were walking into. The man carried his own shadows. Nights filled with faces he could never forget, orders that had left scars no one could see. He had left the military, but it had never left him. Every sound, every movement, every tone of voice still passed through his mind like a calculation. Friend or foe, safe or threat. His dog had been the only thing that pulled him back, the only anchor to something close to peace. Losing that dog, or even watching it harmed, was unthinkable. He didn't just see an animal at risk. He saw the last piece of his humanity being pushed toward danger. The situation could have ended with words, but pride and anger never walk away quietly. One officer stepped closer, boots crunching against the gravel, voice rising as he threatened to take care of the dog if the man didn't act. The dog's bark cut through the air, a sound so sharp that it made the neighbors flinch behind their curtains. The man's eyes locked on the officers, steady, cold, filled with a promise no one understood yet. He didn't move. He didn't back down. That moment hung heavy, but it wasn't the only thread pulling the situation apart. Behind the officers' posturing was a culture that told them they could do no wrong, that their badge was a shield enough against consequence. Behind the man's calm defiance was a life built on surviving men who had thought the same thing in deserts and jungles far away. Two worlds were colliding, both built on power, both unwilling to bend. The hidden cracks in their lives deepened the tension. One officer, new to the force, carried jealousy that no one else noticed. He hated the way his partner always took the lead, hated the way his own words were brushed aside. He was itching to prove himself, to act first, to show he wasn't just a shadow in a uniform. His fingers tapped against his weapon, his jaw clenched tighter with every second that passed. Another officer hid his fear beneath arrogance, the kind of fear that made men loud and reckless. He had never faced true danger, and the growl of the dog pressed against something in him he didn't want to admit. The man's own darkness grew heavier with each second. His thoughts spiraled between calm calculation and the sharp edge of violence. He remembered missions where hesitation had cost lives, where the wrong move had left men bleeding in dust. He measured every step the officers took, every twitch of their hands, and he knew, without question, that one of them would make a move they couldn't take back. The street outside still looked calm to anyone passing by, but in that small yard, at that narrow door, the tension was a living thing. It pressed against every word, every breath, every second. The man's dog barked again, a sound that seemed to cut the morning in half. The officers shouted over it, voices growing sharper, commands turning into threats. And through it all, the man stood silent, eyes cold, body still, waiting. The storm was no longer building. It was here. And it would not pass without breaking something beyond repair. The moment came faster than anyone expected, though looking back, every sign had pointed toward it. The barking had turned into something more desperate, each sound sharper than the last, a wall of noise that seemed to vibrate against the houses around it. The officers were no longer patient, no longer pretending to wait. One of them, the younger one whose pride had burned hotter than his reason, stepped forward with his hand drawn tight around his weapon. He muttered something about being done with this. And that was enough. The man at the door knew what was about to happen. He had seen it in war zones too many times. The glance, the stiffened jaw, the way a man's hand trembled right before he pulled a trigger he wasn't ready for. He felt it in the seconds before it came, his heartbeat steady, his mind sharpening into the cold calculation that had kept him alive in places where no one else had survived. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was his home. This was his dog. The officer raised his gun. The bark cracked through the air like thunder, and then came the shot. A sharp explosion of sound tore across the yard, the echo bouncing between houses, shattering the fragile calm of the morning. The dog yelped, a sound so raw it cut deeper than any weapon, and collapsed against the porch steps. The man dropped to his knees, his hands pressing into the thick black fur, the warmth already fading beneath his touch. His vision blurred, not with tears, but with a rage so fierce it stripped the air from his lungs. The world slowed for him. He didn't hear the officers shouting anymore, didn't hear the radios spitting static. All he heard was silence, the silence of his dog's last breath, and within that silence, something in him snapped. Years of restraint, years of holding back the violence that had been drilled into him, burned away in an instant. What remained was pure instinct, the kind of instinct trained to end lives before hesitation could cost your own. He rose from the porch with a calmness that terrified. His movements were precise, almost too controlled, and the officers didn't see it until it was too late. The first one barely had time to react before the man's hand moved like lightning, disarming him in a single twist, the weapon now pointed in the opposite direction. The gun fired, the shot ripping through the still air, and the officer fell backward, stunned more by the speed than the wound, and the others panicked. They drew their weapons, shouting over each other, but their voices shook. They had trained for control, for order, but nothing had prepared them for a man like this. The man didn't think. He didn't need to. His body acted the way it had 1,000 times before, every movement sharp, every step calculated. He shifted low, his shoulder slamming one officer against the fence, his elbow snapping against a jaw, his grip turning another weapon against its owner. Shots cracked through the yard, deafening, each one blurring into the next, each one matched by screams, by the crash of bodies against gravel and wood. The neighbors stayed hidden, crouched behind curtains and blinds, their hearts pounding in their throats. Some whispered frantic prayers, others clamped hands over their children's mouths to keep them silent. The street had become a war zone, the quiet neighborhood now echoing with gunfire and chaos. No one dared step outside. No one dared call out. The man felt nothing but fire. Every strike, every pull of the trigger was driven not just by anger, but by grief. Grief so raw it demanded blood in return. He thought of his dog's body on the porch, of the loyalty that had been torn from him in an instant. He thought of the arrogance in the officer's voice, the laugh, the command. And with each thought his movements grew sharper, deadlier, until the yard was littered with broken shouts and groans of men who had never faced an enemy like him. But even in the chaos, there was a moment of clarity. For the briefest second, as another officer stumbled backward, bleeding and terrified, the man saw not the uniform, but the face beneath it. The fear, the panic, the same fear he had seen in countless eyes on battlefields. And for that second, a flicker of something passed through him. Regret, maybe. Or just exhaustion. He wondered if this was what his life had always been destined for, if no matter how far he ran from war, it would always come to meet him at his door. Then the sirens wailed in the distance, More were coming. The sound was shrill, urgent, pulling the air tighter around him. The man's chest heaved as he stood in the middle of the chaos he had unleashed, his hands shaking now not from fear, but from the sharp edge of adrenaline. The dog's body lay still on the porch behind him, and for the first time since it began, the weight of what had happened pressed against him. He had fought back, yes, but he had also crossed a line that could never be undone. The surviving officers scrambled, some dragging their wounded away, others shouting into radios with broken voices. Their faces were pale, their movements frantic, a mix of rage and fear. One tried to aim again, but his hands wouldn't steady. Another swore under his breath, cursing the man, cursing the dog, cursing the blood now soaking the ground. None of them had expected this. None of them knew how to handle it. The man stood tall, his weapon hanging at his side, his eyes hollow. He felt the blood on his hands, smelled the gunpowder thick in the air, heard the groans of men who would live, and the silence of those who wouldn't. The porch behind him felt like a grave. His home, once the one place of peace he had left, had been turned into another battlefield, another scar he could never erase. And in that moment, the world held its breath. The neighbors sat, eyed silent. The officers clutched at wounds. The sirens drew closer, and the man stood still in the wreckage of his grief and rage. The crime had unfolded, irreversible and brutal, leaving nothing untouched. The air was thick with smoke and sorrow, and in the center of it all stood a man who had lost everything, and who had nothing left to fear. The street was still shaking long after the last shot was fired. Smoke lingered in the air, the acrid bite of gunpowder mixing with the metallic smell of blood. Sirens screamed louder now, closer, filling every corner of the neighborhood until it felt like the sound itself could shatter glass. Neighbors pressed against their windows, their faces pale, their eyes wide, their hands shaking. They had witnessed something they could never unsee, though many would later say they hadn't seen anything at all. Fear had a way of silencing people, of making them bury the truth before it even found words. The man stood frozen in the wreckage. His dog's body lay on the porch, its fur still damp from his touch, and all the rage that had carried him through the storm was bleeding out of him now, leaving behind a hollow weight. He didn't feel victory, only emptiness. His breathing slowed, his vision clearing just enough for him to take in what surrounded him. The bodies sprawled across the yard, the groans of wounded officers, the chaos he had unleashed in seconds. His mind replayed the moment of the shot again and again, the bark, the gun, the cry of his dog. He could not undo it. He could not bring him back. The officers who survived stumbled into frantic action. Some tried to drag their partners back toward the safety of patrol cars, leaving streaks of blood across the driveway. Others shouted into radios, their voices breaking as they tried to steady themselves. They cursed him, called him a monster, swore that he would pay. But beneath their rage was something else. Fear. They had walked onto a man's property believing themselves untouchable, and now they had been proven vulnerable in the worst way. When backup arrived, the street erupted with flashing lights and shouting voices. Dozens of officers poured into the neighborhood, weapons drawn, faces tight with adrenaline and dread. They moved like an army, shouting orders, positioning themselves behind cars and fences, pointing rifles at the man who still stood motionless on his porch. Helicopters beat the air above, their searchlights cutting through the smoke. The scene looked less like a neighborhood now, and more like a war zone, the quiet suburban street transformed into a battlefield. The man didn't resist. He didn't run, didn't hide. He simply lowered the weapon in his hand and let it fall with a heavy thud against the concrete. His shoulders sagged as he sank to his knees beside his dog, his fingers brushing through its fur one last time before the weight of handcuffs closed around his wrists. He didn't fight when they dragged him away. He had fought enough. The aftermath spread quickly, carried by news cameras that had rushed to the scene before the blood had even dried. The story broke in flashes across screens. Man slaughters police officers in suburban standoff. Headlines painted him as a monster, a killer who had ambushed unsuspecting lawmen. His past as a Delta Force commander leaked through in whispers, feeding both horror and fascination. To the public, he became a symbol, either of unchecked violence or of a man pushed too far. The community fractured under the weight of it. Some neighbors wept openly for the officers, draping their houses in blue ribbons, setting candles on sidewalks, holding vigils with prayers whispered into the night. Others spoke quietly of what they had seen, of how the dog had fallen first, of how the man had only broken after that. But those voices were softer, drowned out by the anger that surged through the city. To mourn the man was to invite condemnation, so most stayed silent. For the families of the officers, the pain was unbearable. Wives, husbands, children, all left to make sense of a violence that had ripped their lives apart. They clung to pictures, to folded uniforms, to badges polished until they gleamed. Their grief hardened into fury, and that fury demanded justice. In their eyes, the man was no victim of circumstance. He was a murderer who had stolen futures, who had destroyed families. Their voices carried into courtrooms and news interviews, demanding punishment, demanding blood for blood. The man's own silence was heavy. In interrogation rooms, he said little, staring at the table in front of him, his jaw locked tight. When he did speak, it was not to excuse himself, but to state a simple truth. They shot my dog. It was the only thing he repeated, over and over, as though those words alone explained everything. To him they did, but to the world outside, they sounded like madness. The psychological toll was deepest on him when the quiet came. In the cold of a cell, he replayed every moment. The bark, the gun, the fall, the rage. He dreamed of deserts and jungles, of the men he had lost long ago, and now of the dog that had been his only anchor. His hands shook when he remembered the feel of fur growing cold beneath his fingers. He told himself he had acted on instinct, that any man would have done the same. But in the dark hours of the night, regret pressed against him like a shadow that would never leave. The media fed on the story, twisting it into whatever version fit their purpose. To some, he was the ultimate threat, a reminder of how dangerous trained soldiers could be when left unchecked in civilian life. To others, he was a broken veteran, a man abandoned by the country he had served, driven to violence by grief and betrayal. The debate raged louder than the truth. No headline could capture the silence of a man kneeling over his dog, or the weight of rage that had consumed him. The ripple effect spread further still. Other veterans watched the coverage with a mix of fear and recognition. They saw in him a reflection of their own battles, the silent wars fought long after uniforms were folded away. Some spoke out about the cracks in the system, about how men like him were trained for violence, but left with nothing to hold on to afterward. Others distanced themselves, afraid that his actions would stain them all with the same brush. The town itself changed. The street where it happened became a scar, a place neighbors avoided, a reminder of a day when ordinary life had collapsed into chaos. Children whispered about it on their way to school, pointing at the house that now sat empty, its porch forever marked by blood. Adults avoided speaking of it at all, as though silence could erase the memory. But silence never erases. It only buries. And beneath the surface, everyone carried the same truth, that something fragile had been broken that day, something that could never be repaired. The man had lost his dog, his freedom, and the last piece of peace he had left. The officers' families had lost their loved ones, their futures stolen in a moment of violence, and the community had lost the illusion that they were safe, that their world was immune to the chaos that lived just beneath the surface. The aftermath was not loud. It was quiet. It was the sound of doors locking, Earlier, of curtains drawn tighter, of neighbors avoiding each other's eyes. It was the silence of a man sitting alone in a cell, his hands still remembering the feel of fur that would never rise beneath them again. It was the silence of families staring at empty chairs across dinner tables. It was the silence that comes when everything that once felt certain has been torn apart. Justice, in the end, came in the form of a courtroom verdict. The trial dragged on for months, with every detail of the crime scrutinized, debated, and exposed to public judgment. When the guilty verdicts were finally handed down, there was a collective sense of relief, as though the law had restored balance to a world shattered by violence. Yet even in the glow of justice, there lingered a sense of incompleteness. For the families of the victims, no number of years in prison could equate to the loss of a loved one. Justice was served in the eyes of the law, but in the hearts of those left behind, the wound remained raw, a scar that would never fade. For the perpetrators, prison was more than a physical punishment. It became a mental and emotional confinement. Some of them carried the weight of their choices with visible regret, tormented by guilt that replayed their actions in endless cycles. Others clung to denial or justification, convincing themselves that they had been pushed too far, that they were victims of circumstance. Either way, their lives were irrevocably altered, reduced to shadows of what they once were. They had crossed a line from which there was no return, and even if freedom were someday possible, the chains of memory would bind them forever. The impact on the victims' families was profound and deeply varied. Some turned their grief into purpose, channeling their pain into advocacy. They pushed for reforms, better mental health support, or stronger laws to prevent similar tragedies from repeating. In doing so, they transformed their personal agony into a force for societal change. Others, however, withdrew from public life, unable to bear the constant reminder of their loss in the headlines and whispers of neighbors. Their grief became private, silent, and consuming, leaving them stranded in a world that moved forward while they remained trapped in sorrow. Friends and associates of those involved were not spared either. Many were left grappling with feelings of betrayal and shame, unable to reconcile the people they thought they knew with the reality of the crime. Some relationships disintegrated under the weight of mistrust, while others clung desperately to fragile bonds, trying to salvage a sense of normalcy. What became clear was that a single violent act had not only destroyed lives, but had unraveled the intricate web of trust and connection that held entire groups of people together. The community itself bore the mark of the tragedy. Once defined by pride, tradition, or a sense of belonging, the town became synonymous with darkness in the eyes of outsiders. Its name, once spoken with warmth, now carried a shadow, a reminder of the crime that had unfolded within its borders. Residents struggled with this shift in identity. Some resisted the narrative, determined to restore their town's reputation, while others sank into bitterness, convinced they would forever be judged for something they did not personally do. The place was changed, not by choice, but by association. The media, as always, played its part in magnifying the story. Headlines sensationalized every development, turning private grief into a public spectacle. Commentators dissected motives, debated morality, and speculated endlessly, often blurring the line between fact and conjecture. For the families, this coverage was a double-edged sword. It ensured attention and accountability, but it also meant living with their tragedy displayed on every screen and newspaper. The relentless gaze of the public transformed the crime from an intimate wound into a cultural talking point, stripping it of privacy and nuance. Public opinion, too, was divided. Some members of the community and wider society empathized with the pressures that had built up around the perpetrators, acknowledging that financial struggles, jealousy, or mental health issues could push people to desperate acts. Others saw no room for understanding, condemning every person involved as irredeemably evil. This clash of perspectives created further rifts, revealing society's struggle to hold two truths at once: that people are shaped by their circumstances, yet still responsible for their choices. On a broader level, the case forced uncomfortable reflections about society itself. The tragedy revealed the destructive power of unchecked jealousy, manipulation, and obsession, showing how fragile the balance within human relationships can be. It also highlighted external pressures, economic burdens, cultural expectations, and hidden secrets that act as silent catalysts for violence. When these forces combine with personal flaws, they create conditions ripe for disaster. Society was left with hard questions. How many other lives were simmering under similar pressures, waiting for a spark to ignite? Legal and ethical lessons emerged as well. Policymakers and activists began to push for reforms, whether in domestic violence prevention, mental health accessibility, or social support systems for struggling families. The crime was no longer just a tragedy confined to a single community. It became a symbol of systemic failures, a reminder that prevention requires vigilance and care from institutions as much as from individuals. At its core, the story challenged simplistic ideas of morality. The individuals involved were not caricatures of good or evil, but complex figures shaped by trauma, insecurity, pride, and fear. Their actions were unforgivable, yet their humanity could not be ignored. This grayness unsettled the public, for it forced them to acknowledge that under the wrong circumstances, ordinary people could commit extraordinary horrors. The line between victim and perpetrator, love and hate, loyalty and betrayal, proved thinner than anyone wanted to believe. The case also illuminated the vulnerability of human behavior. Love, once considered unbreakable, had curdled into resentment. Trust, built over years, dissolved in a single moment of betrayal. The descent into violence revealed just how easily human nature could be twisted, how quickly the bonds that tether us to decency could unravel. In this sense, the crime was not only a tragedy, but also a mirror, reflecting the weaknesses we prefer not to see in ourselves. As the dust settled, questions lingered. Was justice truly achieved? Could intervention at an earlier stage have prevented the tragedy? Was forgiveness possible in the face of such devastation? These questions had no easy answers. Some believed that only through punishment could balance be restored. Others argued that true justice would require deeper societal change, addressing the roots of violence rather than simply punishing its consequences. In the end, what remained was a profound sense of loss, not only for the victims but for everyone connected to the story. No verdict, no reform, no reflection could erase the lives cut short or the families left broken. The community carried scars, the perpetrators bore their guilt, and society was left to grapple with its reflection in the tragedy. The conclusion of this story is not a neat resolution, but a somber meditation on the complexity of human nature. It reminds us that morality is rarely black and white, that justice, while necessary, is never complete, and that the smallest cracks in relationships can widen into chasms of violence if left unchecked. Ultimately, the crime serves as both a warning and a reflection, a testament to the fragility of human bonds and the devastating cost when they shatter.